Hi, I'm Dave, and this is my beginning soldering tutorial. Tonight I'm going to give you an example. I need to attach this 12-volt DC pump to a power wire, and I'll show you how to do that really quickly. Basically, you need a few items to do this. You obviously are going to need a soldering iron. This is the one I'm using. However, there are also other portable models like this one, so take your pick. You're going to need to be able to strip and cut wires with one of these, a wire stripper. You're going to need some solder. This is from Radio Shack. This is 6040 rosin core solder. You're going to need some heat shrink tubing, although if you don't have this, you can also use electrical tape. I just prefer the heat shrink because it provides a much better job. And you're going to need something to hold your work. I use this thing that has some clamps, although you can use pretty much anything that will hold wires for you. Before we start, let's talk about the actual soldering iron that you choose. This one is a nice model from Radio Shack. It's 2-power. High power is 40 watts, low power is 20 watts. I'm going to be operating at the high power tonight because I have some relatively thick wire to solder. This one comes with a nice stand. Prevents anything from getting burned when you put the soldering iron down. However, if you don't want to go this expensive, you can buy one of the cheaper pencil soldering irons. And if you do that, I found actually a soup can works pretty well as a place to rest the soldering iron when you're not using it. This way, basically nothing is going to get burned when you put it down. Before you start soldering, you want to make sure the condition of the soldering iron tip is good. This one has been sitting out for a while and it's kind of oxidized and is dark. So I can take care of this by basically just rubbing it at an angle on a little bit of sandpaper. And what that does is that exposes a fresh amount of copper on the tip, and this copper will allow the heat to transfer much better, and you'll get a much better solder joint that way. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to strip off any excess insulation that you don't need. I'm going to strip back approximately 2 inches of the main insulation to give myself enough room to work with here. So this exposes the 2 power wires underneath. So you've got, in this case, you've got blue for the positive and brown for the negative. Now for the actual wires themselves, I'm going to strip off maybe a 1/2 inch or so of insulation. Like so. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to twist the copper around so that it sticks together. Now here's the stripped off version of the other wire. Now I'm going to twist these together also. However, with this one right here, I don't know if you can see, but this one's heavily oxidized because this was a submersible pump. That's not going to really give you a good solder joint, so we need to get rid of that oxidation. Good way to do this is basically take that same sandpaper and just kind of rough up the ends of it. You can see it looks a little bit shinier now. That should give you a much better solder joint. And now you can twist the wire ends to keep them together. And this next process is called tinning the wires. And this helps prepare the wires for soldering. This will make it a lot easier to actually join them. And basically what you're doing is you want to heat up the copper with the soldering iron briefly before you actually apply the solder itself. So usually I end up having them on opposite sides of the wire. So once you do this, just give it a little touch, and then you'll see the solder start wicking into the copper once it gets hot enough. So now this wire is all prepped. I'm going to do the other one here. Takes a little while to heat up because these are somewhat large wires. Okay, so that wire now has enough solder on it. Okay, now I'm going to go do the other wire here. Remember, this one is a little bit oxidized, so it may not work that great. Now, if you touch a little bit of solder to the iron and to the copper, that will conduct the heat right through to the copper and let it heat up faster. So I'm just going to hold this thing here for a little while. Eventually, the copper should get hot enough so that I should be able to start melting the solder directly on the copper. Once it's hot enough, it'll start wicking in like water. Once it starts doing that, you know you're good. Now I'm going to trim these wires back a little bit to maybe about a 1/4 inch. This will give more than enough joining space. And I'll repeat that process for the other wire. Okay, now I'm going to take some of this heat shrink tubing and I'm going to slide it down the insulation of the wire, and that'll help insulate these two wires once they're joined, because if they touch they're going to short out. So I'm going to use the red one for the indicating positive, and you have to slide it far back enough, at least an inch away from the soldering point, so that the heat from the actual soldering doesn't end up shrinking the tubing when it's back there. Put a red one for the positive, and I'll put on a black one for the negative. That'll help me remember which is which later. Now on the other wire, I have to slide another piece of heat shrink tubing over the overall wire. This will help basically cover up the entire joint when it's done. Alright, so now the wires are ready to be joined. Now this is where the tinning of the wires becomes very important. You can see I've got plenty of solder on both wires now, so technically all I really have to do is apply heat with the soldering iron and the two should join. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply the heat to one of the wires and get the solder melted, and then I'm going to touch the other wire and let that heat transfer over to it and melt the solder on it. When I'm done, the two should be joined. Like that. Wait for it to cool off. And we've got a pretty good joint between the two now. And now I'm going to repeat the process with the other wire. Do the same thing. Basically heat it up on this side and let it melt the solder on the other wire until they join. So now that these wires are joined, I can slide my heat shrink tubing to protect them from shorting out. Just slide them over the wires. And here I can use a heat shrink gun, which is basically a hot air gun, to them. There, now the two are insulated from each other. Okay, now that the two wires are joined and insulated from each other, I can now slide this other piece of heat shrink tubing that I had applied earlier over it, just to protect the joint and make it look better. Air gun. So, the joint is now complete. I may have to wrap a little bit of electrical tape around this heat shrink tubing since it didn't seal real well, but other than that, once I turn on the switch, you can see the motor works.